Hubby secretly sold my family estate and left for Brazil with his mistress while my mom was in critical condition. You won't believe what happened next. My husband sold our family estate while my mother was in the ICU and left with his mistress to Brazil. Can you imagine the betrayal? How could someone I trusted so much destroy everything we built? Stick around, because you won't want to miss how I turned the tables on him. The truth is darker than you think, and revenge? It was sweet and strategic. Keep watching to find out how I made him pay for everything. This isn't just my story, it's a warning. The fluorescent lights in the emergency room flickered slightly, casting a sickly glow over the pale blue walls. The air smelled like antiseptic and something sterile, yet suffocating. My mother's frail body lay motionless on the gurney as the nurses rushed her toward the operating room. Machines beeped in chaotic rhythm, and the urgency in the doctor's voices sent ice-cold dread crawling up my spine. My hands trembled as I clutched my phone, dialing again, my heartbeat pounding louder with every unanswered ring. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he picked up. "What is it now, Elena?" "I'm in an important meeting," Connor snapped, his voice laced with irritation. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my throat constricting as I tried to steady myself. "Mom is being rushed into emergency surgery," I managed, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to keep it even. "I need you here." The silence that followed felt heavier than the air pressing down on my chest. "Sorry, can't make it. Just handle it yourself." His words were clipped, dismissive, like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. And then the line went dead. I stood there, staring at my phone as the weight of his indifference settled into my bones. My husband, the man I had spent 12 years of my life with, didn't care. Not about me. Not about my mother. Not about the fact that she could die tonight. The realization hit me like a freight train. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move, shoving my phone into my coat pocket as I rushed down the corridor toward the waiting room. I needed to focus. My mother needed me, and I wouldn't let her down. The walls of St. Mary's Hospital seemed to close in around me as I dropped into one of the stiff plastic chairs, my hands clenched so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The room smelled of stale coffee and worn-out desperation. Other families sat around me, whispering to each other, their faces drawn with worry. I tried to steady my breathing, but the panic pressing against my ribs wouldn't let up. Then my phone buzzed again. I yanked it out of my pocket, desperate for a text from the doctor, from a nurse, anything that would tell me my mother was still alive. But it wasn't from the hospital. It was from Connor. "Secured my future, just sold the estate, leaving for Bali tonight with someone who actually makes me happy. Goodbye." My vision blurred, my breath catching in my throat. I reread the message 3 times, waiting for my brain to process the words, for them to make sense. The estate, our estate, the home that had been in my family for 3 generations, the house where my father had read to me in the library by the fire, where my mother spent years tending the rose garden she loved so much, the place where every memory, every holiday, every piece of my family's history was etched into the very walls. Sold. To who? The betrayal settled over me like a lead weight, but I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even text him back, because I already knew. I had known for weeks that something wasn't right. The secret phone calls, the sudden interest in my mother's financial records, the way he started asking about property laws, about selling assets, I had known, and that was why I had hired Julian. My private investigator had kept me informed of everything: Connor's meetings with real estate agents, the forged documents he had been presenting as proof of full ownership, the woman he had been meeting in 5-star hotels, Vanessa, his assistant. They had been planning this for months, maybe longer, and they thought I didn't know. A slow, eerie calm washed over me. Connor believed he had won, that he had stolen everything out from under me and left me helpless. But what he didn't know was that I had been watching him this entire time, and He had just walked straight into my trap. The first time I saw Connor, he was standing across the ballroom at a charity gala in Savannah, looking every bit the ambitious young lawyer he was. His dark suit was crisp, his smile charming, his confidence effortless. Back then, I believed in that smile. I believed in the way he looked at me like I was the most important person in the room. He had a way of making me feel seen, heard, like I mattered. My father liked him immediately, impressed by his sharp mind and eagerness to learn about estate management. I remember the way Connor used to sit in my father's study for hours, asking questions, taking notes, genuinely interested in the history of our family estate, or at least, that's what I thought. Looking back now, I wonder if it was ever real, because the man I married, the man I spent 12 years building a life with, was not the man who had just betrayed me in the most calculated way possible. I stared at my phone, rereading his message, letting every word burn into my brain. He had sold my family's estate. He had taken everything from me. And the worst part? He thought he was going to get away with it. I felt something shift inside me. The grief, the hurt, the disbelief, it all evaporated, leaving behind something colder, sharper. He had no idea what was coming. I took a deep breath and pulled myself together. I couldn't afford to fall apart right now. My mother was still in surgery, fighting for her life, and I needed to be strong for her. But that didn't mean I wasn't going to destroy Connor. It just meant I was going to do it methodically, piece by piece, just like he had tried to do to me. I pulled up Julian's number and called him. "Elena," he answered on the first ring. His voice was steady, calm, the kind of voice you wanted in a crisis. "I take it you saw the message." "He sold the estate," I said, my own voice eerily even. "At least, he thinks he did." Julian exhaled, a slight chuckle under his breath. "Oh, he definitely thinks he did. But I've been tracking his movements all day. He signed the paperwork this afternoon, had the buyer wire the funds immediately. Connor didn't want to wait. Of course he didn't. He thought he was about to board a first-class flight to Bali with his mistress, and never look back." "Who's the buyer?" I asked, already opening my laptop. "Guy named Whitmore, real estate investor. Buys up historic properties and flips them into boutique hotels." Julian paused. "And you're not going to like this. Connor fed him a fake environmental report, claimed the house had structural damage. Whitmore's planning to bulldoze it." My stomach lurched. I gripped the edge of the hospital chair, feeling the world tilt beneath me. Bulldoze it. The home my great-grandfather built with his own hands. The home where I had taken my first steps, where my mother had spent decades tending to the gardens she loved so much. The home that held every memory of my father, of our family. I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting the rage settle into something more useful. "I assume the transfer hasn't gone through yet?" I asked. "No, but it's close. I'd say we've got maybe an hour, 2 at best, before it clears." That was all I needed. I took a steadying breath. "Call Whitmore. Tell him to stop the transfer immediately. And if he gives you any pushback, tell him he's about to be implicated in a real estate fraud case." Julian let out a low whistle. "You sure you don't want to be a private investigator?" "Because that's exactly what I was about to do," I smiled grimly. "I just know how my husband operates." As soon as I hung up, I checked my email. Julian had sent me the documents earlier, the ones proving that Connor had been forging paperwork, draining accounts, setting up shell corporations to funnel money. I scanned through them quickly, making sure I had everything I needed. I forwarded the files to my attorney, adding a quick message, urgent. "Call me as soon as you get this." My phone buzzed almost immediately. "Elena, my lawyer, Mark," said, skipping any pleasantries. "I just saw the documents. This is bad. For him or for me?" I asked. Mark sighed. "For him. If what you sent me is accurate, Connor's not just screwing you over. He's committing fraud on a massive scale. Some of these transactions, these aren't just mistakes. These are intentional." I already knew that. I'd known it the moment I saw the bank statements, the way money had been quietly siphoned from our joint accounts. I had just hoped stupidly that I was wrong. What do we do? I asked. I'll file an emergency injunction to freeze the estate sale. We might be able to stall it long enough to stop the transfer. He hesitated. But Elena, if Connor's been planning this for as long as it looks like he has, there's a good chance he's got more tricks up his sleeve. I clenched my jaw. I don't care. I just need to make sure he doesn't get away with this. Mark exhaled. I'll handle the legal side. You just focus on your mom, okay? I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Thanks, Mark. After I hung up, I sat back, letting everything sink in. Connor thought he had planned everything perfectly. He thought he was steps ahead of me, that I would be too devastated by my mother's condition to notice what he was doing. But he had underestimated me. I wasn't just going to stop him. I was going to make sure he lost everything. And the best part? He was going to do it to himself. Hold on, you're not going to believe what happens next. As I pieced everything together, I realized that this wasn't just about an affair or a house, it was about control, manipulation, and destroying everything I loved. But did I fall for his trap, or did I have something he never saw coming? Let me ask you, what do you think will happen when I confront him? Is he going to try to escape, or is there something even more shocking ahead? Drop your guesses, will he get away with it? Comment. 1 if you think he will. 2 if you think it's all about to crumble. I couldn't sit still. The air in the hospital waiting room felt like it was closing in on me, every minute stretching longer than the last. My mother was still in surgery, hours had passed, but no one had updated me. I'd sent a quick text to my lawyer, Mark, telling him to keep working on the injunction while I focused on getting the evidence I needed to make sure Connor couldn't escape this. But even as I took one task off my plate, another felt like it was growing exponentially. I needed to focus. I needed to put every ounce of my energy into making sure Connor didn't win. And as much as my head screamed at me to keep my emotions in check, my heart wouldn't let go of the rage simmering beneath the surface. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd sold our estate, how he'd sold my family's history, my mother's legacy, as though it were a piece of unwanted property. He hadn't just stolen money, he'd stolen memories. The house wasn't just brick and mortar, it was everything. It was where I had grown up, where my father had taught me about the importance of family, of history, of preserving what mattered. And now Connor had sold that. Sold it to some real estate shark just so he could run off with his mistress to Bali. As I paced the waiting room, my thoughts turned to the plan I had set in motion. I had no intention of letting him walk away unscathed. Julian had done his job he'd been tracking. Connor's every move for weeks now, and I had seen the proof with my own eyes. But it was time for me to step in. I had waited for the right moment, and right now, I wasn't going to let him get away with this. I pulled my phone out of my pocket again, unlocking it with shaky hands, and checked my email one last time. The documents were there, the ones that proved he'd been scheming for months. Forged signatures, fake contracts, money being moved offshore. I had everything I needed. It wasn't just about the estate anymore. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about making him pay for every last thing he had done. I called Julian. Elena, everything is moving fast, he said when he picked up. Whitmore hasn't backed out yet, but we need to get to him before Connor does. I know, I replied, swallowing the lump in my throat. I had to stay calm. I couldn't lose control. I've already sent the files to Mark, but I need you to do something else for me. I need you to call the bank and freeze the transfer. We can't afford to let it go through. I'm on it, he said without hesitation. I'll let you know as soon as I hear back. The seconds stretched, and all I could do was sit there, gripping my phone like it was the only thing that tethered me to some kind of reality. I couldn't just sit and wait. I had to do something. So I stood up, pacing again. The clock on the wall ticked louder, each second making my heart pound harder. My phone buzzed. I nearly dropped it in my haste to check. It was Julian. I've got good news, he said. The bank's put a stop on the transfer for now. Whitmore's not going anywhere, but we've got a window. Relief flooded me, but only for a second. This wasn't over. Get him to sign the paperwork. I want everything in writing. If he tries to back out, we go straight to the authorities. Tell him I'm not letting him off the hook. I hung up and ran my hands through my hair. This was happening. This was real. I could feel the adrenaline racing through my veins. There was no turning back now. I hadn't planned to tell Connor what I knew yet. I wanted him to think I was as clueless as he thought me to be. He had underestimated me from the start. But now it was time for him to see just how badly he had miscalculated. I knew the game he was playing. He thought I would be too consumed by my mother's health to notice what he was doing, that I'd be too distracted by the chaos around me. But that was where he had made his biggest mistake. I had already been gathering information for weeks. I had been watching him, tracking his every move. The night he left for Bali was the night I'd already set things in motion. I checked my watch. It was almost time. I had to move fast. There were only so many ways I could delay the transaction, and if I was going to hit Connor where it hurt, I needed to do it before he thought he could get away. I stood up again, feeling the tension build inside me. My mind was sharp, focused on the next step. Everything had to be in place before he even realized what was happening. I paced over to the hospital window, looking out at the city streets below. It was strange, the way everything felt so normal outside while I was trapped in this whirlwind. Life kept moving forward, and yet here I was, fighting for something much bigger than just my mother's recovery. But I couldn't let it distract me. Connor had no idea what he had just triggered. The door to the ICU opened, and a nurse stepped into the waiting room. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to face her, my eyes wide. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "Elena," she said gently, "your mother's surgery went well. She's stable for now, but she's going to need a lot of care as she recovers." Relief washed over me. My mother was still here. But as I took a deep breath, I knew that this was far from over. My world had been turned upside down, and Connor had made the biggest mistake of his life by crossing me. He thought he had won, but he had no idea what was coming. The real battle was just beginning. The minutes felt like hours as I sat in that sterile hospital waiting room, trying to steady my breath, my mind racing with everything that had happened. My mother was in recovery, stable for now, but I knew she had a long road ahead of her. And here I was, tangled up in a nightmare of my own, making only it wasn't me who had set this trap. It was Connor. I thought I knew the man I had married. I thought I understood his heart. But now I realized I had been living in a house of lies, and it had all come crumbling down in the most brutal way possible. I had always thought Connor was a good man, a little ambitious, sure. He had big dreams, and I had supported him in every way I knew how. But somewhere along the way, those dreams had turned dark. The man who once spent weekends tending to my mother's rose garden with me had turned into someone I barely recognized. The late nights at the office, the strange phone calls, the increasing tension between us, it should have been enough to make me suspicious. But I had ignored the signs. I had chosen to trust him. And now, as I sat there in that waiting room, I realized how foolish I had been. But I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I wasn't going to sit by and let him destroy everything we had built, everything my family had worked for. He thought he could sell our estate and disappear with his mistress, but I wasn't about to let that happen. I leaned forward, my palms pressed against the cold plastic of the chair. My mind kept replaying the moments when I'd realized just how deep Connor's betrayal ran. The first time I caught wind of something wrong was when I saw an email on his phone, buried beneath a stack of unread messages. It was a simple message, nothing too out of the ordinary. But the name on it caught my attention, Vanessa, his assistant. The email had been about a property deal in Rio, mentioning a transfer of funds and discussing the sale of our estate. I should have confronted him then, but I didn't. I told myself it was just business, that I was overthinking things. After all, he had always been so careful with money, always dotting the I's and crossing the T's. But that email kept nagging at me. There was something in the way it was worded, something that felt too casual, too familiar. I should have listened to my gut. As I sat there, Staring blankly at the walls, I could feel the weight of everything Connor had done pressing down on me. The estate wasn't just a property, it was a part of my family's legacy. It had been passed down for generations. My great-grandfather had built it with his own hands, and my father had cherished it like a living thing. And now, in one swift move, Connor had stripped it all away, sold it to the highest bidder, and planned to run away with Vanessa. It was sickening. The thought of him celebrating in some luxurious hotel room with her, laughing over champagne as our family history was being destroyed, it made my blood boil. But then, something shifted inside me. It wasn't just anger, it was resolve. I wasn't going to let him win. I wasn't going to let him tear apart everything my family had fought so hard to preserve. He had made the mistake of underestimating me. He thought he could walk away from this without facing any consequences. But he was wrong. I stood up suddenly, my hands shaking with adrenaline. The hospital room felt too small, too suffocating. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here waiting for things to fall apart. I pulled out my phone and called Julian again. The call rang twice before he picked up. "Elena," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "I've got the documents. I forwarded them to Mark. We're all set to file the injunction, but we need to move fast." "I know," I said, my voice tight with determination. "But we need to do more. We need to stop the sale from going through. Whitmore can't get his hands on the estate." "I'm on it," Julian replied, his voice steady. "I'll call the bank again and make sure the transfer is frozen." "Good. And keep me updated. I'm going to confront Connor." There was a pause on the other end. "Elena, are you sure about this? Confronting him could make things worse." "I don't care," I snapped, feeling a cold rush of anger flood through me. He's already made things worse. It's time to make him pay for what he's done. I ended the call and stood still for a moment, the weight of my decision hanging in the air. Part of me knew this was risky. If Connor knew what I was planning, he could disappear for good. But I didn't care. He had stolen from me, from my family, from everything I held dear, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I took a deep breath and pulled myself together. I couldn't afford to make mistakes now. I had to be smart. I had to play this game with precision, with strategy. If I was going to win, I had to outsmart him at every turn. I headed for the exit, my heart pounding in my chest. As I made my way through the sterile hospital halls, I couldn't help but wonder how I had missed all the signs. How had I trusted him so completely? But there was no time to dwell on the past. I had to focus on the present. I had to make sure Connor didn't walk away with everything. I reached the elevator, and as the doors closed behind me, I glanced at my phone. No new messages, but I knew the clock was ticking. Every minute I waited was another minute for Connor to get closer to escaping. As the elevator descended, I made up my mind. I was going to take the fight to him. I wasn't going to let him think he had won. The sale wasn't final yet, and I still had a chance to stop it. If I had to go to the ends of the earth to make sure Connor paid for his betrayal, then that's exactly what I would do. I had waited long enough. Now it was time to take control. The tension in my chest had been building all day, a tight knot that seemed to get worse the longer I waited. As the minutes dragged on, I could feel the anger and betrayal gnawing at me from the inside. Connor thought he was clever, thought he could get away with selling our family's legacy and running off with his young mistress to a life of luxury. But he didn't know who he was dealing with. And now, as I sat in the sterile waiting room, the weight of it all was starting to feel real. It was time to make him understand just how wrong he was. I had everything I needed to bring him down. The forged documents, the bank statements showing how he'd been slowly draining our accounts for months, the email from Vanessa confirming that their plans were already in motion. I could feel the pieces falling into place. I wasn't just going to stop the sale, I was going to make sure Connor paid for everything he'd done. And when I thought about how he'd tried to ruin my mother's health, how he'd played me like a fool while thinking he could walk away unscathed, I felt a cold, calm certainty settle over me. But there was one thing I hadn't expected: how much power this situation would give me. The moment I saw the truth, the moment I realized what he was doing, it was like a switch flipped inside me. I wasn't the woman he had married anymore. I wasn't the one who had stood by, trusted him, let him take control. No, now I was in control, and I was going to make sure he felt every ounce of the consequences of his betrayal. I stood up abruptly, my legs unsteady as I pushed the door open to the ICU. My mother was still asleep, her body hooked up to a maze of wires and monitors, but the peacefulness of her face didn't calm me. It only reminded me of the stakes. I couldn't afford to lose her, not to her illness, and certainly not to Connor's schemes. I paced back and forth across the room, my thoughts spinning. The clock was ticking, and I knew I didn't have much time. Julian had been working hard to keep things under control, but now it was my turn to take action. I needed to move fast. I called him again, the urgency in my voice betraying the calm exterior I was trying to maintain. "Julian, I need you to keep pressure on Whitmore," I said, my tone sharp. "Tell him I'm not backing down. We can't afford to let this go through. If he so much as tries to move forward with this, I'll make sure he regrets it." I could hear the crackle of the line as Julian acknowledged my instructions. "Don't worry, Elena. I've got this. Just focus on making sure Connor doesn't get away. I'm setting up everything on my end. But if he contacts you again, don't let him know what's going on." "I won't," I replied, my voice steady despite the rising storm inside me. "I'll handle this." I ended the call, but the weight of the situation pressed down on me once more. Every move I made, every choice I had to make, felt like it could tip the scales one way or the other. And yet I knew in that moment that I had already won. Connor might have thought he had the upper hand, but I had learned to fight back. And now I was going to make sure he lost everything. I turned my gaze back to my mother, and something in me softened. I had to do this for her, for everything she had worked for everything she had built with my father, the legacy that Connor had tried to destroy in one reckless move. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about making sure our family's history wasn't erased by greed and selfishness. I ran my fingers along the edge of the desk where my mother had kept all her important papers, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of purpose that was stronger than my anger. I was ready to face him, ready to bring this fight to an end. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced down. The text from Julian was brief, but it told me everything I needed to know. "Whitmore's been briefed. The transfer is on hold for now, but you need to move quickly." I nodded to myself. This was it. I took a deep breath and dialed Connor's number. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears as I waited for the call to connect. The anticipation was unbearable. "Hello?" His voice came through, smooth and casual, as though nothing had changed. As though I hadn't just discovered everything he'd been doing behind my back. "Connor," I said, my voice steady but carrying the weight of everything I'd been holding in. "You've made a huge mistake." There was a brief silence on the other end. I could practically hear the wheels turning in his head, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what was happening. "I don't know what you mean," he said finally, his voice cool, his usual arrogance dripping from every word. "What's this about?" "You know exactly what I mean," I replied, my voice cutting through the air with a quiet certainty. "You thought you could sell the estate, take my inheritance, and run off to Bali without anyone noticing. But you're wrong. You've been playing a dangerous game, Connor, and now it's over," he scoffed. "You don't know what you're talking about. I've done nothing wrong. Then why don't we see what the authorities have to say about that?" I asked, leaning against the desk. "How about we take a look at the documents I have? The ones proving that you've been embezzling money, forging signatures, and trying to steal what doesn't belong to you." The silence on the other end was thick with shock. I could almost feel him scrambling to cover his tracks, his mind racing to figure out how to talk his way out of it. "You don't have anything," he said, though his voice trembled ever so slightly. "I've got everything," I replied, my voice hardening with finality. "And I'm not stopping until you've paid for every lie every piece of betrayal. I ended the call, knowing there was nothing more he could do. He was cornered now, and there was no escape. I stood there, my fingers trembling as I hung up the phone. Connor's words still echoed in my mind, his arrogance seeping through even the thin veil of panic he was trying to hide. He thought he could talk his way out of this, but I had him cornered. He knew it, and I knew it. Now, it was just a matter of time before he realized that everything he had carefully planned, every lie, every piece of paper he'd forged, was about to come crashing down. The adrenaline coursed through me, sharp and fast, but I couldn't afford to lose focus. My mother's life was still hanging by a thread, and Connor, this man I once loved, had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He thought he could leave me behind, walk away with everything we built together, and start fresh in some tropical paradise with his young mistress. He thought I wouldn't notice. He thought I'd be too lost in the chaos of my mother's health to pay attention to the signs. But the truth was, I had been watching him for months, watching him lie, steal, and manipulate, watching him destroy everything he claimed to care about for his own selfish gain. But now the tables had turned. I knew that every minute I waited was one more minute he had to prepare his escape, to cover his tracks. But he didn't realize I was already 3 steps ahead. I had everything. The forged documents, the bank statements, the proof of his affair. I had the truth, and I was going to make sure the world knew it. I could feel my pulse in my neck, thumping loudly, my mind racing. I turned toward the window, looking out over the city. The view from the hospital wasn't spectacular, but it was enough to give me a sense of distance from everything. From the chaos of my life that had been spun out of control in the last 24 hours. My mother's surgery, the estate, Connor's betrayal. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was going to burst. But then, in the silence of that moment, I realized that everything I had done, everything I had fought for, was leading to this. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I wasn't going to let him slip through my fingers, thinking he could destroy everything I held dear without consequences. My phone buzzed again, cutting through the tension. It was Julian. His voice was low, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach tighten. "It's done," he said, each word heavy with meaning. "I've got the bank to freeze the transfer. Whitmore's out of the picture for now, but you need to move quickly. We've got one shot to stop him before he tries to flee the country." "Good," I said, feeling a chill run through me. "Tell the authorities to be ready. Connor's not going anywhere." Julian hesitated, and I could hear the concern in his voice. "Are you sure you're ready for this? This is going to get ugly, Elena." "I've been ready for this since the moment I found out," I snapped, my voice sharp and unwavering. "He made his choice, and now I'm going to make him pay for it. I'm not backing down." I hung up the phone and let the silence swallow me for a moment. The calm before the storm. I was about to face Connor, face the man who had broken me, who had taken everything I thought I knew about love and trust, and shattered it. And yet, despite everything, I wasn't afraid. The fear had drained away the moment I decided to take control. I wasn't going to be the woman who sat quietly by while he destroyed everything. I had a plan. The documents, I had everything from the forged signatures to the wire transfers, the emails, the fake contracts was all in place. And I wasn't going to let him worm his way out of it. He thought he could cover his tracks. He thought he could outsmart me. But he couldn't have been more wrong. I pulled myself together, wiping the sweat from my palms and straightening my shoulders. It was time to confront him. The moment had arrived. And as I walked out of the hospital room, I felt a quiet confidence settle over me. This was my fight, my battle to win, and I wasn't going to stop until Connor had everything taken from him. I made my way to the exit, my thoughts sharp and clear. I wasn't the same person I had been a few days ago. The woman who had stood by Connor's side, trusting him without question, had died the moment I realized what he had done. And now, all that was left was the woman standing here strong, determined, and ready to take on whatever came next. As I stepped into the elevator and watched the doors close, my heart beat steadily in my chest. I wasn't afraid, I wasn't anxious. For the first time in a long time, I was in control. I knew exactly what I had to do. When the elevator doors opened, I walked straight toward the front door, the weight of everything I had lost and everything I was about to gain heavy on my shoulders. It was time to make him pay. I felt the weight of every step as I walked down the hospital corridor, the cool air against my skin doing little to soothe the fire that had ignited inside me. Everything in my life had led to this moment. I had spent days, weeks watching, gathering information, piecing together the puzzle of my husband's betrayal. I had allowed myself to grieve, to be vulnerable, but now I was done with that. Now it was time for him to face the consequences of what he had done. Connor had always been good at hiding things. He had a way of making everything seem smooth, effortless, like there was never anything beneath the surface. But I had learned to see through that. I had learned to trust my instincts, and I had learned, far too late, that everything I thought I knew about him was a lie. I had been a fool. I had believed in the man he used to be the one who cared about family, the one who shared my dreams of building a future together. But that man had vanished the moment my father died, and in his place had been someone darker, someone who only cared about his own desires. And now, that person had taken everything I had ever loved and tried to destroy it. But I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I couldn't. The elevator ride felt like an eternity, the numbers above the door flickering as the floors passed by, each one marking the distance between me and Connor. Each passing second felt heavier, but I couldn't stop now. I had to finish what I started. The city's skyline outside the windows was a blur of lights and shadows, but all I could focus on was the plan I had set in motion. I was going to make him regret ever crossing me. When the elevator doors finally opened, I stepped out, my legs steady despite the rush of adrenaline. The building was quiet, too quiet, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of doubt. But that moment passed quickly. There was no turning back now. Connor was going to pay, and I was going to be the one to make sure of it. The tension in the air was palpable as I approached the front door of the building where Connor had been staying, the place where he had been meeting with Vanessa, the woman who had been helping him ruin our lives. I had already called ahead, set everything in motion. I knew exactly what I was walking into. I knew he would try to deny it, to play the victim. But this time, I wasn't going to let him spin his lies. This time, I was ready. I reached for the door handle, feeling my pulse quicken. But just as my hand brushed the cool metal, my phone buzzed. My heart skipped a beat. It was Julian. "Elena," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Whitmore's trying to back out. He's on the phone with his lawyer right now, and if you don't act fast, everything will fall apart." I clenched my jaw. Of course, Whitmore would try to weasel his way out of it. He thought he could just buy his way out of the mess Connor had created. But he was wrong. He had no idea who he was dealing with. "Tell him I'll be there in 10 minutes, I said, my voice icy, calm. "I'll handle it from here." I ended the call and took a deep breath. It was time. I wasn't going to give either of them a chance to run. This was my family's legacy, and I was going to protect it. I pushed open the door and stepped into the building, the sound of my heels echoing in the hallway. My steps were deliberate, measured. I was in control. I had to be. I had come too far to let anything derail my plan now. When I reached the door to the penthouse, I didn't hesitate. I knocked once, twice, then pushed it open without waiting for an answer. Connor was standing by the window, his back to me, but I could tell the moment he heard the door open. He froze. His shoulders tensed, and I could practically feel the shift in the room. He knew. He knew I was here to end this. Well, I said, my voice as steady as I could manage, but underneath it there was a thread of something darker, something colder. "It seems you've gotten yourself into a bit of a mess." Connor turned around slowly, his face flickering with surprise before his usual smirk crept across his lips. "Elena," he said, his voice smooth, like nothing had changed. "I didn't expect to see you here. I thought you were busy with your mother." I didn't flinch. "My mother is fine. but that doesn't mean I'm going to sit by and let you destroy everything we built. His eyes narrowed. What the hell are you talking about? I stepped forward, my gaze never leaving his. You think you can sell our estate, take the money, and disappear with her? I said, pointing at Vanessa, who was standing by the door, her face flushed with anxiety. But you're wrong. I've got everything I need to put you both away. Vanessa opened her mouth to say something, but I silenced her with a look. This wasn't about her. This was about Connor, the man who had betrayed me, the man who had tried to take everything I loved and crush it beneath his heel. You don't have anything, Connor said, his voice rising, his mask starting to crack. You can't prove anything. I smiled, a cold, calculated smile. I don't need to prove anything. I just need to make sure you lose everything. The tension in the room was suffocating now. I could see the panic in his eyes as I stepped closer, and I could feel the power shifting. He had thought he could walk away from this unscathed, but now he was trapped. Do you know how many people you've hurt, Connor? I asked, my voice steady, my gaze piercing through him. How many lives you've ruined for the sake of your own greed? He took a step back, his eyes darting between me and the door. He was calculating, thinking of ways out, but there was no way out now. I had him. You should have never underestimated me, I said, my voice sharp. You made your choice. Now it's time for you to face the consequences. I turned to Vanessa, who was standing by the door, still frozen in place. You can leave now. You're not part of this. She didn't hesitate. She turned and left, her heels clicking against the floor, leaving me alone with Connor. And just like that, it was over. Your flight to Bali is cancelled, I said, my voice low and filled with satisfaction. And everything you thought you had, your money, your future, your freedom, it's all gone. Connor stood there looking at me like he couldn't believe what was happening. But I wasn't done. Not yet. You'll be hearing from my lawyer soon. And the authorities? They're already on their way. I'm not letting you get away with this. The shock on his face was everything I had hoped for. It was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when everything fell apart for him. And it felt damn good. I could feel the air thickening around me as I stood in the center of the penthouse, staring directly at Connor. The calm facade he wore was starting to crack, his smirk faltering as the gravity of the situation sank in. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to finally hit. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the room erupted in tension. Connor took a half step back, his eyes darting to the door, then back to me. He was trying to calculate his next move, but I could see the panic beginning to edge into his eyes. This wasn't how he'd planned it. He had thought he had everything in his control. He thought I would be too distracted by my mother's health to notice what he was doing. But I had noticed, and now it was too late. You're not getting away with this, I said, my voice low and firm. The words felt like they had weight, like they were carrying all the anger and betrayal I had been holding in for months. You thought you could sell our family's legacy, destroy everything we've worked for, and run off to some island with her? I jerked my thumb toward Vanessa, still standing by the door, her face flushed with guilt and uncertainty. But you were wrong. You've been lying, stealing, and planning behind my back. You're not getting away with it. Connor's face twisted in frustration, his usual smug demeanor starting to crumble. Elena, you don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice rising. I did what I had to do. You've been weak, too weak to handle anything. I'm saving us both. You'll thank me later. I could feel the disgust rising in me, like bile in my throat. How dare he try to justify this? How dare he act like I was the one who didn't understand? No, Connor, I said, my voice gaining strength. You've been taking advantage of me, taking advantage of my trust, my family's trust. You thought I wouldn't see it, but I did. I see it all now. He scoffed, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what was happening. This is crazy, Elena. You're blowing everything out of proportion. I took a step forward, my heart racing but my mind clear. No, you don't get to tell me how to feel anymore. You don't get to twist this into something it's not. You sold the estate, you drained our accounts, and you thought you could leave me in the dust. Well, guess what? I'm not the one left behind here. You are. His face went pale, the realization hitting him hard. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes, true fear, not the calculated coldness that had always been there before. It was in that moment that I knew I had him. His carefully constructed world was falling apart. The lies he had built his life on were coming undone. You think you can control everything, don't you? I continued, my voice steady but filled with an icy anger. You think you can manipulate everyone, buy your way out of every situation. But this time, you're going to face the consequences. You can't just walk away from this. You don't get to destroy everything for the sake of your own greed and then waltz off into the sunset with her. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably by the door, her eyes flicking back and forth between us. I didn't care about her anymore. She was just another part of Connor's web of lies, a pawn in his game. It was Connor I wanted to focus on. Connor the first needed to break. He stepped toward me, his hands raised in what seemed like a defensive gesture. But I wasn't fooled. The desperation in his eyes was too real, too raw. You don't understand, he said, his voice quieter now, tinged with an edge of panic. I had to do it. I did it for us, for our future. You did it for you, Connor. The first spat. This was never about us. This was about you, about your ego, your need to control everything and everyone around you. You were never thinking about me, or my family, or our future. You were thinking about yourself, and now you're going to pay for it. I could see him wavering now, his bravado slipping. You're making a huge mistake, he said, trying to regain some of the control he had lost. You can't do this. The estate is already sold. You can't undo what's been done. I smiled, a cold, calculating smile that felt foreign on my face. You really think that, don't you? That you can't be stopped? I stepped closer to him, the distance between us closing as the power in the room shifted entirely in my favor. You've been so careful with your lies, so meticulous in your planning. But I've been watching you, Connor. I've known exactly what you were doing, and I've been setting you up for this moment. You thought you could escape with everything? Well, now you're going to find out how wrong you were. For a split second, his mask of confidence shattered. His eyes widened in disbelief, and I could feel the tension crackle in the air between us. He was terrified. Not of me, not really, but of what was coming. Of the walls closing in around him, the consequences he hadn't planned for, the fate he hadn't seen coming. You think you have me cornered? He asked, his voice shaking, barely masking the fear creeping in. I'll fight you on this, Elena. I'll take you to court. You won't win. I met his gaze, unflinching. You've been lying to me for months, Connor. You've been stealing from me, from my family, from everyone who trusted you. There's no coming back from that. And as for court? I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. You're already facing fraud charges. And this is just the beginning. His face went slack, his mind racing as the full weight of what I was saying hit him. What? What are you talking about? I'm talking about the evidence I have, I said, my voice unwavering. The bank transfers, the forged documents, the emails from Vanessa, everything you've done. It's all there, and I'm making sure the right people see it. I took a deep breath, letting the satisfaction of the moment sink in. You're done, Connor. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who you are. For the first time since this whole nightmare had started, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't powerless. I had the truth on my side. I had the law on my side. And I had made damn sure Connor wouldn't get away with this. I'm done, I said finally, my voice steady. And so are you. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. I stood there, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The house, the estate, The family legacy, it all seemed to hang in the air, just beyond my reach. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. My hands trembled, but not from fear. No. This was the kind of trembling that came with finally knowing you had won. I had fought for this, for my family's history, for my mother, for everything I had ever loved, and now it was mine again. Connor's betrayal had almost destroyed everything, but it had also given me the clarity I needed to do what I had to do. The sounds of the city outside seemed distant now, almost muffled by the weight of the victory that was finally within my grasp. I had watched Connor stumble, seen him make mistake after mistake, and now he was reaping the consequences of his actions. The court hearing was set. The lawyers were already prepared. Everything was lined up, every step planned, and I knew there was no way out for him. He had tried to destroy my life, and now I was going to destroy his. But as the days passed and the pressure built, a small part of me wondered if I was doing the right thing. I wasn't the same woman I had been before. All the innocence I once had, the trust I had so easily given, was gone now. Connor had taken that from me, but at what cost? The lines between right and wrong had blurred so much over the past few months. I had done everything I could to fight back, to make sure he faced justice, but in the quiet moments, I wondered how much of me had been lost in the process. I shook off the thoughts, the nagging doubts, and focused on the next step. My phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was Julian. Elena. His voice came through loud and clear, and I could hear the tension in his tone. "We've got a problem. Connor's lawyer is trying to move the case to a different jurisdiction. They're stalling." I closed my eyes for a moment, my heart skipping a beat. Of course they were. Of course Connor would try to do anything he could to get out of this. But it didn't matter. I had already anticipated this. I had thought of every possible angle, every move he might make, and now I had to act. Tell them. "They don't have a leg to stand on," I said, my voice steady, but my pulse was racing in my veins. "We've already filed the papers. The evidence is clear. They can try to stall all they want, but they won't win." Julian's voice softened slightly. "You're sure? The last thing we need is for them to drag this out longer." I clenched my jaw, my mind sharp and clear. "I'm sure. I've got this handled. Just make sure everything is in place on your end." We're not backing down now. The conversation ended, but the sense of urgency didn't fade. I stood by the window in my apartment, watching the city below. The streets were busy, filled with people rushing to and from their lives, completely unaware of the storm that had been brewing in mine. The world seemed so far removed from the battle I was waging, the battle that had consumed me for so long. I had once been part of that world, part of the normal rhythm of life, but now everything felt different. Nothing felt simple anymore. Connor had changed everything. He had taken so much from me, from my family, but he had also forced me to change. I wasn't the same woman I had been before. I had learned how to fight for what was mine, how to survive when it felt like the world was collapsing around me. I had learned to be strong in ways I never thought possible. And that strength, it wasn't going anywhere. I was going to make sure of it. A few days later, the phone call came, the one I had been waiting for. The trial was set. My lawyer, Mark, called to confirm the details, and I could hear the relief in his voice. Everything was in place. Everything was ready. "Elena, it's time," he said, his voice firm but kind. "We've got them cornered. Connor and his team won't be able to get out of this." I nodded, though I knew he couldn't see me. "I'm ready," I said, though my heart was pounding in my chest. The courtroom was packed the day of the trial. The air was thick with tension as I stepped inside, my heart racing. The bright lights overhead felt oppressive, but I kept my head high. I wasn't afraid anymore. The evidence was clear. I had done everything by the book. This was my moment to make sure Connor couldn't hurt anyone ever again. I took my seat, my hands folded in my lap, trying to steady my breath. Across the room, I saw Connor, standing with his lawyer. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, and for the first time in months, I saw the fear that had been hidden behind his arrogance. His world was falling apart. and he knew it. But even as I watched him, I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. No, it was something different. It was relief. The end was finally near. The trial began, and I sat there, listening to the testimony, the evidence, everything I had worked so hard for coming together piece by piece. It was a strange feeling seeing everything I had feared, everything I had lost, finally being accounted for. The truth was out in the open. And now it was Connor's turn to answer for what he had done. By the time it was over, I was exhausted. My body ached with the weight of everything I had carried, but as the verdict was read, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The gavel slammed down, and it was done. Connor was guilty. He was going to face the consequences of his actions, and there was nothing he could do to change that. As I walked out of the courthouse, the world outside felt different. It wasn't just the victory that changed things. It was the way I had come out on the other side, stronger than I had ever been before. The pain, the heartbreak, it was still there, but it no longer had the power to control me. I had won, not just for myself, but for my mother, for my family, for everything I had ever loved. Connor had taken so much, but in the end, he had nothing left. He had underestimated me, and I had made sure he paid for it. The future was mine to shape now. I could finally move forward, no longer bound by the past, no longer weighed down by the betrayal. The estate was mine again. The legacy was safe. And as I looked out at the world before me, I knew I was ready for whatever came next. Because nothing could ever take away my strength again. Can you even imagine what Connor must be feeling right now? I had him right where I wanted him, but there's one more twist you're not expecting. How far would you go to protect your family's legacy? Would you let someone destroy everything you love just to walk away scot-free? The final move I made changed everything. Stick around to see how this all ended, because the last shock is the biggest. Trust me, you'll never see this one coming. The lesson here is simple. Never underestimate your own strength, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. Betrayal can shatter you, but it can also teach you how resilient you really are. I learned to trust my instincts, to fight back, and to never let anyone take away what's mine. The truth always comes to light, and the consequences for those who think they can manipulate others are inevitable. If you stand firm and stay true to what you believe in, you'll come out stronger on the other side.